Well, welcome back, everybody. Lesson 10, the last lesson.
Finale. We're here, finish line.
Yeah, we're feeling good. And we, again, just want to say thank you for your faithfulness in leading your groups. This has not been an easy book in some ways, and we have learned a lot, as we prepare for these videos. So we know that the Lord has been working in y'all's groups as well. So all right, so here we are looking at chapters 15 and 16 of 1 Corinthians. And again, we're coming back to another new topic, and that's the topic of the gospel and the resurrection specifically. So a way that you might want to start out is to just ask again to your group, okay, what's the issue at hand here? And what we think is that Paul has kind of saved the most important thing for last in a way. And maybe the thing that he wants them to remember after they've heard the letter or had the letter read to them. What are they going to walk away kind of remembering the main idea? And so the issue that we think is going on here, you can even see it in verse 12, is that some of the Corinthian believers are actually saying that there is no resurrection of the dead. They may be even saying that there is a resurrection, but maybe not a bodily resurrection. So issues around the resurrection are what's at hand here. And possibly, as we've seen through most of the letter, it's because of their the pagan culture and their proclivity for spiritualizing and, elevating the spiritual above the bodily. And so it's really going to come out here where Paul is really going to hammer on them, again, as he did before when we talked about the issues of the body more in earlier chapters, that he's going to hammer on that. It's
interesting in some ways. It's almost as if they're buying into a philosophy in which they thought the body was merely a tomb. It was a trap, a prison that they needed to be freed from, as if that was the release from the body, as if that was what would be being spiritual would be. And so Paul's going to try to kind of go, no, there's not just a renewal of the soul, but there's also going to be a renewal of the physical body, that there's a holisticness with which God is moving that is beyond kind of what they had grasped. And so he's going to correct that, because ultimately the ramifications of that misunderstanding are incredibly significant. And so we're going to end here kind of a linchpin, a closing finale that's going to be incredibly strategic and important for him.
Yeah, for sure. So as you walk through, we kind of saw that this section that's actually in the packet is sort of like an ABA, where in the first 11 verses, he is going to say, yes, there is a resurrection, and he's going to give some of the historical reasons that it's true. And then in 12 through 19, it's almost like he's going to say, but you're saying no, there's not. And then if you say no, there's not, these are the logical conclusions that you must come to. And he's ultimately going to say those are illogical. And then back in 20 through the end of this, 24, is coming back to A, which is, yes, there is a resurrection, and some of the longer term consequences of it, and the rest of the chapter as well.
Love that. As you guys jump into kind of the interpretive section, question one, it kind of getting to, why does Paul kind of start the way he does? Why is he particularly kind of talking about the gospel that was handed down to them from Paul, but also from and according to the scriptures? And so I think there's multiple things going on here. That it's not just that we keep kind of getting a multiple kind of issue-driven kind of topics, but what we also kind of see under the current often, or under the surface, is this kind of particular pushback against Paul himself personally. And so I think one of the things that he's doing in verses 1 to 4 is he talks about the gospel and takes it not just the gospel that he received and he passed on, but the gospel that's according to the scriptures. Is he's trying to create a distinction that what they're against isn't just Paul and Paul's gospel, but ultimately they're against the entirety of the scriptures and what the scriptures have been saying. And so they aren't just kind of in this one-on-one battle, but ultimately their departure is not just from Paul, but ultimately from the tradition that's been passed on by the entirety of the apostles. And so I think that's a huge piece of that. And as Carolyn said, this opening section that he's also highlighting, that their departure from what he's saying is also a departure from historical evidence and what's there. That to say there is no resurrection defeats even historians that have spoken and written as to what had happened. And so they're departing not just in this kind of resistance against Paul personally, but they're departing from a tradition that's been passed on, not just Paul, but the entirety of the apostles and even the scriptures that have talked about the fact that Jesus has died and ultimately was resurrected.
Yeah. What's interesting, again, this came to me in our very first lesson. Paul's writing this 20 years after the resurrection. There's literally people probably alive who witnessed the resurrection. Of the 500, there were people. So they're going against eyewitness testimony in a sense. So, yeah. So question 2 then is a really great question for you to kind of, again, if you're uncertain about what people are thinking and believing in your group, to actually go through the elements of the gospel that are right here in the text. This is one of the clearest and most succinct descriptions of the gospel that there is. And so we would suggest that even pairing up maybe in this question and saying, hey, turn to one another. And if somebody asked you, hey, what's this gospel that I've been hearing about? How would you respond? And just go through it, have them even just identify the pieces that are in 3 and 4 and 5, which is Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. Christ was buried. Christ was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and he appeared to many. That is the clear essence and distillation of the gospel.
As a reminder, at the end of kind of the application section of the previous lesson, we talked about how to share the gospel kind of with the 3 circles skill. We're going to repeat that in this lesson. And so you are welcome to kind of get to the end of the lesson and kind of jump back into that if you missed it last week. Or you could, in the midst of kind of pairing people up and having them respond, if they're really struggling, you could kind of hit pause, go to that, flip a page over, kind of walk them through the 3 circles that helps them kind of walk through how to share the gospel. Let them practice that. Let them rehearse that. And it's okay if we jumble up the order of things. It kind of fits just here with this clear kind of sense of what the gospel is.
Yeah, for sure. And then question 3 does hit on that section about why it's logically inconsistent to say that there is no resurrection. And here you could, kind of pull out some of the actual points that Paul's making. He would say that our preaching is in vain. It's empty. It's devoid of truth. And that their faith then would be in vain or empty or worthless even. They would, if there was no resurrection, that we would be bearing false witness against God. It continues on down that you're still in your sins. The consequences of not believing in the resurrection, that Christians who have died are lost. So then the ultimate is that we are people to be most pitied if the resurrection is not true. I think that's another section you could spend a little bit of time helping people kind of think through the consequences of why the resurrection is critical.
I think it might be most helpful as you're kind of walking through and maybe save question 4 for the last interpretive section and kind of take question 5, because I think it's a little bit more to the point of, so what's Paul saying about the resurrection? And particularly in verses 42 to 44, you get some really easy, obvious contrasting statements. And so he'll talk about how the body that we have now is a body of dishonor, but we'll get a body in the future that's a body of glory. We have a body now that's sown in weakness, but we'll get a body in the future that's sown in power. And then what I love the most that he does here is he also says that we have a body now that's natural, and we're going to get a body in the future that's spiritual. And what he does there, I think for years I've read past it and just thought, I think walking through this book for another time, I realized, he just flipped them on their head when he said the body that they're going to get in the future is a spiritual body. He's not saying that the body is non-physical. What he's saying is he's taking the spiritual word and he's saying that to be spiritual is actually to be physical. Mm-hmm. And so he's flipping the whole argument, because the idea of how do I get away from a body of dishonor, weakness, and naturalness is not to escape from physicality, but it's to have the physical body not just resuscitated from death, but to be recreated in a different kind of way. And so he's going to paint a view of the future, of our future spiritual mature existence, is not one that is just kind of non-corporeal or non-bodily, but is to have a physical body integrated with our immaterial souls. And that physical body is recreated, this time in power, imperishable, without pain and without death. And so he's going to flip that in a sense by calling that's what spiritual actually is. And they've been missing it all the way back to the beginning of chapter 1. And when they thought what it was to be spiritual was something just intellectual. So he's going to give them an integrated sense of existence that's both material and immaterial, both recreated, both renewed by the end. Question 4 kind of gets you into a little bit of what are the end times and a timeline. And so beginning in chapter 15, verse 20, I think what you get in a sense is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We were laughing as thinking of a race. It's the starting gun. As he's resurrected, we kind of begin to cue off end time events. And so that's the first piece of what will unfold. Now, when the other pieces come, the timing of them, can we clock them? We don't know. Or we know that we can't. We don't know when they're going to happen. But we do know the resurrection of Jesus Christ, his physical resurrection, is a starting gun for the rest of the things that follow. So what are those things that follow? Well, we know as we think about what's coming in the future that a moment's going to come when Jesus is going to meet his church in the clouds. We refer to that as the rapture. Some great passages on the rapture are John 14, 1-3, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51-53, and then I think one of the best ones is 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13-18. And so you get a sense of the church, the believers who have died and the believers who are still present will be raptured. They'll meet Jesus in the clouds, and they will be in the presence of Jesus immediately in those moments. And that begins to cue off a series of end time events. And so you have the rapture, and then you have something known as the tribulation. If you really want to jump into it, Daniel 9, verses 24-27 are a wonderful description of some of the things that you can expect. But ultimately what we see is it's a time that's trying, but particularly it's a time that God's designed for the nation of Israel to ultimately repent of their sins, to finish and to be atoned for sins, so that by the time we get to the end time events that are going to follow even past this, we're going to have not just the believing church present, but we're going to have a redeemed and restored nation of Israel alongside of the church that will experience the return of Jesus, the establishment of his kingdom on earth before we eventually get to the renewal of all things and a new heavens and a new earth. And so what we kind of get through here is a sequence of events that are kind of triggered on top of one another. And there's all kinds of resources out there for timelines of end time events. And what I would say to you guys is, you could jump into this rabbit hole and there are about 8 different tentacles that you could run off. And I would just say, keep it simple. Allow for some level of curiosity on some of that if there's some discussion, but ultimately keep it back to what's the whole point of this section. The whole point of this section is that there's a resurrection for believers. That resurrection for believers is contingent upon the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so because of those things, we can have a confidence that our future is going to be one in which our souls and our bodies are renewed and integrated holistically together.
Yeah, so good. All right, and then that takes us to our application. We thought maybe you could nuance question 1 a little bit by maybe asking in addition, what are you longing for renewal in your life, or where are you longing for renewal of brokenness in relationships, or physically, or things like that, just to get people thinking about that's what our hope is. That is where we are pointed to, is the beautiful restoration of all things through Christ. And then the other one goes with that is so if that is our future, that is the end of our human history, how does it impact our present priorities now? I think both of those questions can be really good to end.
Again, we have kind of the Engage tool of the sharing the gospel using the 3 circles method, which you can see in the back of the packet, pages 138 to 139. Again, we looked at that last week. We said you could do it earlier in the lesson. You could do it here. And so the last thing we would just say, since this is our last lesson, this is our last video, is there's also a synthesis to come. So Carolyn, could you kind of give us some closing thoughts for groups if they were to do synthesis after this lesson or to do synthesis another night?
Yeah.
How do you do it well?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. Some of us are good finishers, some of us are good starters. I do think to keep it at if you're doing it paired with this lesson, to point it out, to say this would be a good exercise that you could go through as an individual in the weeks to come, since we're not having group time probably in the next few weeks, take some time to go back as a review of the memory verses that you might have been working on. On page 116, there are actually some really good sort of like synthesis questions that people could work through. But then, and an outline if you want to. It's sort of like you can make it what you want. But I do think that trying to pull out, if I were leading a group, I would say, could you think through one theological truth, maybe a new one that the Lord really showed you, and then how it applied to your life. What life lesson kind of paired with that? If someone could walk away from this study remembering those two things, I think that it would be really good for them. Just as, again, not to just say, okay, done, we're done with that, but to see how you could prayerfully continue to apply the lessons that you've learned.
We talk about this a lot as a staff. I think that we often feel like we're not great at reflection or celebration. And so part of what we're trying to create a moment for in the synthesis is a space or a moment to be reflective, but also to be celebratory as to what the Lord's taught, what the Lord's done in us. And so trying to create the moment to do that, which is why we kind of have that standalone section for you to stop and to not just kind of close it, say we're done, and to move on to the next thing, but to look back. And we typically don't do that great. So I encourage you guys to kind of make that a priority, create space to do that.
Yeah. Okay, that's all we have for you. We've really enjoyed being with you guys.
We're grateful for you guys leading and grateful for the impact the Lord's had in you guys and through y'all this semester. Thanks.